In this video, we're going to talk about building job sequences. A job sequence is the ability to batch together a bunch of different processes or run jobs or code or whatever you need to do to build out a fully formed process. Okay, so initially what we did was we built some ETL processes, like for instance the load transactions job that we had built. That's an ETL job. Okay, and what we have a couple other ones out here called load products, load stores, and then the load transactions. So what we want to do now is kind of tie those things together to go out and say, I want to load the products, I want to load the stores, and then I want to load the transactions. So I need some kind of way to tie all that together to run it in a batch, and that's called a job sequence. So up here on the new menu, you'll notice there's two different job types. There's the ETL job type and the sequence job type. And the sequence job type is where we're going to tie all this together and build a process. Under the menu options over here, you'll notice there's a job sequence area. And there are some objects in here that are specific to running a job sequence or building a job sequence. And only these objects can be used in the job sequence type of job. There's also process objects. Process objects are things like running code or running SQL statements or shelling out to call an external program and things like that. We can also use the process objects in the job sequence. Okay, so in our first example, we're going to build a simple job sequence that simply loads our products, loads our stores, and then loads our transactions. Okay, so the way I want to do that is I'm just going to call some run job objects. I'm going to pull those onto my designer, and then I'm going to call a wait for jobs and then another run job object. Because what we want to do here is we want to load our products and stores, we want to wait for those to complete, and then we want to load our transactions. So the run job object, I simply double click on it, and I'm just going to tell it which job I want to run. So I come up here and I select the job. Oh, and you might get this message here. It says, to correctly bind this job to the sequence, you must save this sequence first. So basically what that means is I'm tying this job sequence and I'm building a bunch of pointers to a lot of other jobs in the system. So I need to save that job sequence in the app domain so that it can actually see those jobs and point to them. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and save my job sequence first. And I like to put SEQ in front of my job sequences. You can name them anything you'd like, but I'll call this one load process. Okay. Now if I jump over here to the job control window, you'll notice that now I have this sequence load process job out here, and it has a slightly different icon than the ETL jobs. And that's sort of my indicator to say, you know, this one is a job sequence and this is a ETL job type. So you can kind of see that in the job control window. And then if we jump back to the job here, I'm just going to click on each one of my jobs and I'm going to select the job that I want to run. So first I want to load my products. Then I want to load the stores. Then I want to wait for those two jobs to finish. And the way that I do that is I say, I pick the selected jobs that I want to wait for. So I'm just going to simply pick the load products and load stores because I want to wait for these two jobs to get done before I continue on in the sequence. And then I'm going to click on the last run job and I'm going to load my transactions. Now this one had a parameter, so it's going to prompt me for that parameter when I initially load it here. We can just take the default though. Okay, so now what's happening is it will run this job, it'll wait for it to complete, then it'll run this job, wait for it to complete, and it'll wait for the jobs. So that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, because what if I wanted to run these two jobs in parallel, and then I want to wait for those two jobs to complete, and then I want to load up my transactions. So the way that we can do that is you can actually run multiple jobs in parallel and wait for them to complete through this property right here. That's the wait type. So initially, or by default, when you run a job, it says run and wait. And what that means is run it and wait for it to complete before continuing on to this job. But we want to run that job and not wait. We want to run that job so that it kicks it off and immediately then kicks off this job. It doesn't wait for this one to complete. And that's how we're going to control what things we run in parallel and what things run and wait for it to complete before it continues on in the sequence. So these two jobs we're going to run in no wait. So it's going to initially just kick this one off, and immediately jump to this object. So these two will be running at the same time in parallel. And then it's going to stop here, and I'll kind of rename this one. I'll say wait for dimensions. And that'll wait for those two jobs to complete, and then it'll do the transaction job. And that's it. So I'm just going to go ahead and compile this and run it. So very quickly you can see we can create a process in which I can tie a bunch of jobs together, and I can also put some logic around that as to how I want to do that. So I'm going to go ahead and kick my sequence job off here, and what we should see is the load products and stores will immediately kick off at the same time and run in parallel, and then those two jobs will complete, and then the load transaction job will run. Okay, again, it's going to prompt me for my file that I want to load. Okay, so now we see load products and stores are running in sequence at the same time. Those two things are going to wait to finish. And then finally the load transaction is going to load. Okay, so you'll notice that what happened there was it loaded these two jobs, and then it waited a little while until this one kicked off. So why is that? What is the reason for that? So the reason is because these two kicked off immediately, and then I said wait for jobs, but the default is to check every X number of seconds to see if these two jobs are done yet, and it defaults to 30 seconds. So that's kind of long for a small process like this. That's, if I'm running 5 or 6 or 7 jobs at the same time, then I might want to wait 30 seconds in between so that I'm not checking every few seconds to see if that's done. But for a smaller process like this, we could actually change this down to like 2 seconds. Check every 2 seconds to see if these two jobs are done. And then the process will go much faster. Okay, so let's compile that and try that again. Okay, so I'm just going to run this again. Well, again, we're going to see our load products and stores kick off. And then what we're going to see is the load transactions. And immediately you'll see load transactions then kicks in, because it only waited 2 seconds to see if the load products and stores had completed before then kicking off the load transactions. Okay. So that is a quick example of how to create a sequence to load things in a batch and to control a whole process. So some of the other things that we can do is we can actually do if statements. We can do folder watches, where it kind of watches a folder to see if a file shows up. We can run SQL in a database if we need to. So there's all kinds of things that we can do to build out our process and get the things done that we need to get done. So let's take another example here. Let's say, for instance, I want to do an if statement and I want to kind of wrap this whole thing into an if statement here. So how do I've already kind of drawn out these lines, but now I need to modify my sequence. So that's simple. You can just click on the line and hit the delete key, and that'll kind of get rid of some of these lines here, and then we can kind of move our objects into place and reconnect things. Every time I hit the compile, it'll rebuild the program anyway, so I can disconnect and reconnect these lines as much as I want. Okay, so I'm just going to kind of rename this and clean it up a little bit. Okay, so what we're going to do here is I want to wrap this logic in an if statement that says if today is Sunday, I want to load the products and stores. If it's not Sunday, then just load the transactions. So the way that I do that is on the if object, I can just double click on it and I get a code behind window. And I could just run some code here. I could just say, basically I want to return a Boolean as to whether this if statement will be true or false. Okay. So I'm just going to say if now dot day of week equals system dot day of week dot Sunday, then return true, else return false. So if today is Sunday, this will return true, and it'll fall into here, and it will load the products and stores. If it's not Sunday, this will return false, and it'll immediately jump here to the end if, and it'll only load the transactions. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and click OK here and compile it. And today happens to be Wednesday, from my perspective. So if I come over here and I run this, what we should see is these two jobs will not run because today is Wednesday, and I said I only want you to run these two on Sunday. I should only see that the transactions run. So let's go ahead and run that. And you'll notice that only the transactions ran. It skipped over the products and the stores. All right, now if I come back here and I change this and I say, yeah, you know what, I want it to run on Wednesdays, which is today. Then I can just simply change the code, recompile, and then run my job. And what we should see here obviously is it'll load the products and the stores, and then it'll run the transactions because today's Wednesday. Okay, so basically, I can do all kinds of stuff here. If I wanted to run some SQL, or maybe I want to do some under my process objects here, I could write some code. I could run some SQL statements. I could send an email. So, like, maybe I want to send an email after this process completes. I could do that. So I can come in here and just say, my SMTP server is, I don't know, I'm just making this up, but 123.1.75. And I want to send it to myself. Okay, so you get the gist. So basically, I'm just filling this all out, and I'm kind of filling out my properties here, and that'll send me an email after that process completes. Okay. Let's say I want to run some SQL after this job completes. So maybe after all this completes, I want to go back into my database and maybe clean up some staging tables, or run some calculations against some tables to kind of do some final calculations. Okay, so I can kind of throw a run SQL on here. And the way that the run SQL object works is I just go up here to my connect string, and I can walk through my wizard here to connect to my database. And again, this is going to be very similar for almost all databases. And then what I can do is come down here into my SQL statements, and I can just enter in the SQL statements that I want to run. And I can run multiple SQL statements. So for instance, I can say, maybe here on the first one, I can do my update statement. So I can update transactions table, set sell price equal to sold dollars divided by sold units. Okay, so you'll notice I ran out of space here. So if I hover over the SQL window here, you'll notice I have a button here that I can click. That also takes me into the code behind window, where I can actually type in my SQL a little bit better. Okay, so I'm just kind of making up things as I kind of go here, but maybe I want to truncate a table. Get it ready for the next run. And I can add more SQL objects here. I can append a new row or insert. Okay, and maybe I want to truncate another table here. So you can see that as each statement runs, it's going to run in this order. So I can just continue on. I can give it a whole bunch of SQL statements here, and then I can test those SQL statements if I want. So I have some buttons here. I can say run the SQL in the current row, or I can say run all of the SQL statements. Okay, I can copy the entire script to the clipboard. Okay, so let's say for instance I need this code, and I can copy it right all to the clipboard if I want. So that's kind of handy if I want to jump over to like SQL Worksheet or SQL Workbench or some other tool that I can want to test my SQL out in. Okay, I just click OK, and now at the end of this process, after load transactions completes, it'll go ahead and run this SQL statement. So run my SQL. So you can do that as well. So as you can see, you can kind of wrap these things here, and you can kind of create this whole, inline SQL or sequence of events that's going to happen. And that's how you create sequence jobs.